All right, I think we've got a lot of people on, which is great. As we begin today's program, I want to acknowledge that this virtual showcase is replacing our biggest fundraiser of the year. It raises critical funds so that MCEA can do our work. I'd like to take a moment and recognize our generous sponsors that have made these events possible. Thank you to all of our donors and sponsors who make the work of MCEA possible, and a special thank you to our presenting sponsors, Compass Financial Management, Peter Bachman and Janet Rice, Peter and Ann Reich, and Design 45. Today's event, Spotlight on the Legislature, is just one element of Voices Driving Change and MCEA's work. Please learn more about our upcoming events, read the stories of the Voices Driving Change in our magazine, and support our work at www.voicesdrivingchange.org. Please plan to join us for Legally Green on September 24th. That's just 2 days away. This capstone event is our annual fundraising event. It is unlike any other virtual event. Beautifully staged with fresh and dynamic content, this 35-minute program will leave you energized and inspired. After the event, you will have the chance to hear some untold stories and ask questions of our team. Please register today at voicesdrivingchange.org. If this is your first time, thank you for being here. The Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy uses law and science to protect Minnesota's environment, its natural resources, and the health of its people. Thanks to the investment of people like you, MCEA has been on the forefront of Minnesota's environmental movement for almost 50 years. MCEA works in the courts, at the legislature, and with public agencies to create, strengthen, and enforce smart environmental laws. All of the work of MCEA is made possible by the generous support of our donors. Please join us in fighting for a healthy and sustainable future by texting DRIVE CHANGE to 844-949-3684 or visit www.voicesdrivingchange.org. Your support will make more possible. All right, let's begin. Welcome to Spotlight on the Legislature. I'm Kathryn Hoffman. I'm the CEO of MCEA. Many of you are familiar with our work in the courts and at the PUC, but did you know that we also have the biggest dedicated team at the Capitol fighting for our environment? The goals of our legislative work are to shape smart and effective laws to protect our air, water, and climate, and to prevent rollbacks of the bedrock environmental laws in Minnesota. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Representative Jamie Becker-Finn. She is the Minnesota State Representative for District 42B in Roseville. She is an assistant Hennepin County attorney when she's not up at the legislature. She's the vice chair of the Environment and Natural Resources Policy Committee and also a member of the Outdoor Heritage Council. She truly cares about the environment. Representative Becker-Finn is a champion to us. Her own campaign website says that she grew up in northern Minnesota. She's a Leech Lake Ojibwe descendant. She spent her childhood playing in the woods, learning about fishing, hunting, wild rice harvesting, and farming with her family. It means a lot to pass these traditions on to her kids now, and that she and her family especially enjoy ice fishing, checking our trail cams, and visiting new parks. Welcome, Representative.
Yeah, glad to be here with everybody. Virtually, of course.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we'll see if there's some questions in the Q&A as well. So if you do have questions, go ahead and put those into the Q&A section to our audience. All right, so what made you decide to run for office?
Yeah, so my path is a little different than some other folks. So as you mentioned in my bio, I grew up in northern Minnesota on the Leech Lake Reservation, and my dad served in the state Senate in the early 90s. And so I kind of grew up around that, and it made it seem like it was just another career one might choose. So my brother and I sort of grew up knowing elected officials by their first names, and it was just like, oh, maybe you'd be a teacher, a nurse, or legislator. And so it was never one of those things that seemed impossible to me, but at the same time, it wasn't something that was my goal my whole life. Essentially, we had an open seat a couple of years ago, and I was very conscious of the idea that women tend to redshirt themselves from running for office. They tend to wait until their credentials are even more than they actually have to be, and so I decided to go for it, and it's been really great, and I really love this job, and despite multiple Zooms at the same time, and how difficult this year has been.
Yeah. Speaking of this year, what was the biggest win for the environment at the Capitol this past session, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think one of the most notable things was Representative Wozlowick's bill to ban TCE. So if folks will remember, that was, you probably saw in the news about water gremlin. So TCE is a toxic chemical, and we found out that it had been released into part of the area that's part of my legislative district, as well as others who live around the White Bear Lake area for it now sounds like 17 years. And we were able to be the first in the country to ban that toxic chemical. And with a divided legislature, anything can be pretty difficult, but particularly when you're talking about, kind of going up against the chemical industry and doing something really important like this. I think that was incredibly important. The other piece to that was really notable was that the driver of getting that done was the community who was impacted. They organized early on. They hold weekly meetings with elected officials, as well as Minnesota Department of Health and the MCEA, and they just really kept at it and kept pushing us to make this happen. And so it was really great that we were able to get that done this legislative session.
Yeah, I love that the citizens were a big driving factor in bringing about bipartisan cooperation. That's our experience as well at MCEA, is when our work is grounded in community and the affected groups, it becomes much more powerful. You mentioned water gremlin that use TCE. They also they actually use that in the process for manufacturing lead tackle, which is another issue that's come up with the legislature. Do you expect that issue to come up again this year, or are there other issues you expect to see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that until we take meaningful action on protecting communities from lead, I think that's going to continue to be an issue that we discuss at the legislature. It's one of those tricky issues where the minute you try to move any legislation forward regarding lead, it sort of activates the gun industry and makes people think about lead bullets, and it just makes it really, really difficult, because there are forces and funds working outside the legislature to not have us do anything about that issue. But I think overwhelmingly, when it comes to lead, when you talk to just average Minnesotans, when I talk to my constituents, it's just common sense that we would want to ban a toxic chemical from being used in our environment. I did have some bills this past year to kind of come at it a little bit differently, try to do a little bit more of a carrot than a stick method. And I do think that there's room there to get people to make that choice once they have good information about how easy it is to switch and why it's so important.
You say more carrot than stick. You're talking about bills to educate hunters and people who fish in what products to buy.
Yeah, and things like trade-in programs. So a lot of times the reason people don't transition away from using their lead products is if you're like my family, you probably have a lot of tackle sitting around in your garage or in your tackle box, or maybe you stocked up on the bullets you use for target practice, or there are lots of reasons why you might be hanging on to a lot of it. And some of the states that have been more successful have done trade-in programs or incentivized switching. You know, maybe it's a coupon, maybe it's catching new hunters right after they get their first license to make it easier for them to try out that non-toxic ammunition or tackle and see that, you know, it can work for them. And so I think that's it's always going to be more when you're working with both sides of the aisle. It can be really helpful to do things where you're not penalizing people who maybe might not choose to the most environmentally sound option.
Yeah, we were up in my cabin this past summer in Upper Michigan, and, you know, pulling out these old tackle boxes. My grandpa probably bought some of that tackle, you know, and I never thought about it until this past year. Oh, you know, these sinkers, they're probably lead, and we should think about upgrading that. Because what is the impact when we see this used in the wild, these lead products?
Yeah, so I actually initially got involved in this issue. So I've been a deer hunter my whole life, and so the biggest problem is for bald eagles. So around deer hunting season, if you're a hunter, you know, the remnants of the deer that you leave out in the field, that lead can, when it hits an animal, it dissipates into a pretty broad area where it's so small that you can't see it. And so even the best intentioned folks might not realize, but they're leaving those tiny pieces of lead out in the environment, and then the animals come and clean it up for us, and they can be poisoned. We actually see the Raptor Center sees a bump in the number of lead poisoned eagles coming in the weeks following the deer season every year. So we know there's that link there. And then of course, if you followed any of the lead tackle issues, our Minnesota state bird, the loon, can be negatively impacted by accidentally ingesting lead. And the other important piece to that for folks who aren't familiar is that it takes a teeny tiny little piece, like the pin prick of the tip of a pencil, can poison a bird, because they don't weigh very much, and their systems can't handle it. And so it's incredibly important. We know it's a toxin, and we have alternatives.
Yeah. Another issue that comes up year over year at the legislature is the issue of wild rice and sulfate. There was actually an article in the Star Tribune this morning about climate change affecting the range of wild rice and where it grows. Wild rice populations are declining across the state, but another challenge in addition to climate change is sulfate pollution. It tends to come from mines and also from wastewater treatment plants. Can you give us an update on where things stand on that issue?
Yeah, well, things really shifted on this issue when Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan took office, partially because they're actually trying to do this in a way that fully recognizes the sovereignty of our Native nations here in Minnesota. And so they, part of the reason that we haven't pushed any particular piece of legislation forward is that they are doing that true consultation with tribal governments and their individual, natural resource departments to make sure that they are fully engaged in this process. And, so people may know that wild rice is our state grain. But for folks like me, for a lot of Indigenous people, our wild rice has spiritual significance and is incredibly important to the continued, our populations and our communities continuing to thrive. And I think another piece to that people don't realize is that wild rice also has huge economic impacts for tribal communities. There's a lot of folks who harvest that rice and may sell it, and because it's so valuable, I imagine it's even possible there are people on this call who maybe haven't actually had real wild rice. I mean, even in Minnesota, you can go to a restaurant and they'll give you some gross rice pilaf thing that isn't actually wild rice. So the real deal is incredibly important, spiritually, economically, and also is just a really healthy food for families to eat.
It is a really special food. It's amazing. And I was on that governor's the panel that Governor Dayton put together, the advisory group panel, and it was people from a lot of different backgrounds. But I will say one thing that was pretty much unanimous among all the panel members was that the conversation really couldn't move forward without the robust participation of the Ojibwe. So I'm glad to hear that that process is happening. Before we leave the session, there was the legislative session, there was a question about the Environmental Trust Fund and why that didn't pass. And I think specifically, I'm guessing they're asking about the allocation of the funding, the money that comes out of the trust fund each year to pay for certain kinds of projects that was not allocated this year. What are the chances that that happens?
I think until we have different elected officials in our legislature, I'm actually not very hopeful that we get this done, in any special session. I think it'll be next year with some different personalities and maybe some different folks engaged in the conversation. It's been really. This is, I think, one of the biggest environmental disappointments this year was that we weren't able to get those funds out. So for folks who aren't familiar, because I know it sometimes is confusing for people. So the trust fund is the lottery dollars, is the shorthand way to think about it. And then the legacy funds are the additional % of sales tax that goes to outdoor water, arts and cultural heritage things. But so the Natural Resources Trust Fund, that bill really got hung up in political differences and sort of got used as a bargaining chip, despite the fact that, these are funds that are, the residents of Minnesota who paid for the money that goes into those funds expect to be put to good use in the environment, and unfortunately that didn't happen. So and the way that it works, so we have the LCCMR and the different councils that make the recommendations on how to spend the money, but then ultimately they have to be allocated. A bill has to pass the legislature and the governor has to sign off on that. And so that's the hang up. It's not because those aren't good projects, and unfortunately it's resulted in lost jobs as well, because some of those are ongoing projects that really should have been funded. And but we'll keep pushing, because it's very important. And I think, as well as the other legacy funds, that we get those dollars out into the community. And honestly, now with the economic downturn, it's more important than ever that we make those investments in Minnesota.
Yeah, especially when the voters have so resoundingly supported putting funds into those areas. So as a legislator, you probably interact with a lot of lobbyists, including folks from MCEA. What do you rely on groups like MCEA for?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things is that in the heat of the legislative session, those of us who are very engaged with what's going on don't necessarily have the ability to sort of get the word out to average Minnesotans and people who care about these issues, because we're stuck at the Capitol, or this year stuck on Zoom for hours on end. And so I find that outside groups, like MCEA, can kind of activate those networks of people when important things are coming up at the legislature in a quick way that I don't have the capacity to do, because I'm on the front lines. And it's also really helpful. You guys tend to have really good in the legislature, we talk about a one-pager. So it's like maybe one side, maybe both sides, distilling down the argument, in favor or against a specific bill, having those little graphics and those things that are easy to share on social media with voters. All those things are really helpful, and things that we simply as legislators don't have the capacity to do without those outside allies, helping to get the word out about what's going on.
Yeah, we do pride ourselves on our one-pagers. I can even think of circumstances where people who are opposed to the bill were sending out our one-pagers simply because they were so clear in describing what actually was happening. Some of these bills, of course, being very lengthy and not always easy to understand when you read them.
Yeah, shout out to the graphic design folks who make those look that good.
So how can the average citizen get involved here? We've talked a little bit about citizen engagement. What's helpful to you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the main thing to know is that any person, any Minnesota resident, particularly people who vote, is that you are the most important people that we hear from, and for me especially, I take the feedback and the conversations that I have with my constituents are held to a higher level than, I mean, sorry lobbyists, but the conversations I have with lobbyists, because at the end of the day, I feel like I am accountable to the people who elect me. And so it's incredibly important that we hear from you. And it really, it can come in a lot of forms, I would say, especially now, because our staff isn't physically sitting at the state office building able to answer our phones. Maybe a phone call isn't what it used to be, at least for the Minnesota legislature, but emails, letters, just keeping in touch and letting us know what's important to you. And I would even say, if I got 20 emails in one day on one specific issue, like, I would remember that moving forward. And I also think it's helpful when I hear stories from individuals about how different bills have impacted or would impact them. And then those are stories that we can share when we're debating these issues at the legislature. I think it's much more, as much as I love the one pagers, the most powerful thing I can share is a story about how something has impacted a person. And so those are all ways that the average person can definitely stay involved.
Yeah, for sure. And if you want to be on MCEA's list to hear about opportunities to contact your legislators and get involved at the legislature, then go to our website at mncenter.org and click on Get Involved, I think is the link. I'll bet it will appear momentarily in the chat because there's some people with these links listening, but there's a way to do that through our website as well. There was a question to the panelists about COVID-19 and the changes at the legislature. You've referenced a couple times how different this last session was. What was the biggest challenge for doing your work as a legislator during this time?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, just as humans, it's hard to do to be focused on really hard work and to kind of lift all those things at the same time. A lot of us are at home with our kids, with spouses working from home and just everything, family members and people we know kind of in our orbit who are sick or we're worried about getting sick. So I think, sort of that heaviness has definitely been there this legislative session. As far as like actually doing our legislative work, I think that our staff, and especially the nonpartisan staff, has really done a great job of making it possible for us to still pass bills and move legislation. But, we don't get to have sort of the robust back and forth that you would have naturally in a committee in person, where you're able to really get into a conversation with your colleagues, any of that sort of face-to-face relationship building stuff is really hard right now. Phone calls are great, and Zoom is a great tool, but it just isn't the same as being in person with folks. So, I would say, maintaining those relationships and building new relationships with different legislators, particularly, in the other party, is a lot more difficult when we can't kind of hang out together at the fishing opener, for example, or get a beer together and interact as people and not just as elected officials.
Yeah. Okay, I love this question. It's sort of like an interview question, but what's the best thing about being a legislator, and what is the worst thing?
Okay, so the best thing for me is that I am a person who has gotten bored at every other job I have had in my entire life, and working as a legislator is not boring. There is always something more I could be nerding out on. There is always something else I could dig into. And I really love that part of being a legislator, is that you really can lean in to spending your, if I want to watch that documentary about, election fraud or something, like voter rights, I can watch that documentary and it feels like a valid use of my time. Or for me, especially being on the Outdoor Heritage Council, I like to think that when I visit different parks or WMAs, that I'm sort of doing some of my homework in knowing more about those parts of the state. I think the hardest part is just is sort of the other side of that coin, is really that we're never not working. If you're doing this job right, it is much more than a part-time job, despite sort of the idea that we have a part-time legislature here in Minnesota. I think particularly for those of us with kids, I have 2 elementary school aged kids. There's kind of an infinite number of things I could be doing to serve my constituents and to do my job better. And so, many of us don't really have hobbies. Our hobbies are the things that allow us to do this work.
Yeah, I've always really admired legislators for the way that they have to balance the, full-on schedule part of the year and campaigning and other work the rest of the year, and then, at least in theory, hold another position. I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, and to be honest, just so to be honest with people, is like the last 2 years, I actually have stayed on leave from my county job because it just has been too much. And particularly now, where I'm most days I'm the lead distance learning parent at home. My parent, or my spouse, has a full-time 9-to-5 job, demanding job. So much of my work can be done in the evenings answering emails and such. So I end up carrying that load too.
Yeah, for sure. So we just have a couple more minutes here. One question that I had was, you mentioned your legal job, and it feels right to have a conversation with another woman lawyer this week of all weeks, because Justice Ginsburg, who just passed, was such a leader that forged the way, for you and me to be leaders as well. How does it help your job as a legislator to also have that legal education and background?
Yeah, well, I think, right off the bat, I think particularly as a woman who, for the purposes of being a legislator, skews younger, and an Indigenous woman, is that, sort of having that law degree kind of instantly gives you that credibility with some people who maybe don't value some of the other things that you think make, should make you credible. But I think, that off the bat was especially really helpful to me when I was first elected in my first term. I think as well, it's, as legislator or as attorneys, we're sort of trained to not shy away from conflict. And so sort of leaning into the places where we disagree and trying to work things out is a skill and a thing that we really, as attorneys, are trained to do and not be afraid of. So I find that that's also super helpful with this job. If you're willing to sort of fight those fights, it can be really important.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your leadership, Representative. We're so grateful for it. And thank you for your time today. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but in the interest of, I think, wrapping up on time, we want to go ahead and finish up. And people should feel free to also contact me separately. In closing, you can get involved. Make sure there's some links in the chat there. It looks like you can sign up for our newsletter. There's also www.mncenter.org/takeaction. You can be on action alerts for us. Thanks again for joining us today. All of the work of MCEA is made possible by the generous support of our donors. Please join us in fighting for a healthy and sustainable future by texting Drive Change to 844-949-3684 or visit voicesdrivingchange.org. Your support will make more possible, and your gift helps MCEA staff protect the Minnesota we love for future generations. I hope you'll continue to enjoy the events in our showcase. Thanks again to our generous sponsors and our supporters. All these events are free. Plan to join us for Legally Green on September 24th, our capstone event. It's our annual fundraising event, and it is unlike any other virtual event that you'll see. It's beautifully staged with fresh and dynamic content. This 35-minute program will leave you energized and inspired. After the event, you'll have the chance to hear some untold stories and also ask questions of our team, especially if you didn't get your question asked today. That's a good place to do it too. So register today at voicesdrivingchange.org. Thank you.